If you spend enough time looking into early colonial history, you will inevitably hit a fierce, ongoing internet debate. Were the Irish actually the first slaves brought to the Americas? Proponents of this theory point to a period in the mid-1600s when tens of thousands of Irish people were forcibly deported, sold, and worked to death on sugar and tobacco plantations. The origin of this forced migration lies in Oliver Cromwell's military conquest of Ireland. Beginning in 1649, his campaign ravaged the island, leaving an estimated 500,000 people dead from war, famine, and plague. To manage the survivors and clear the land for English settlers, Cromwell implemented a policy of transportation. His forces systematically rounded up military prisoners, widows, and orphans. These people were packed into the holds of ships and sent to American and Caribbean colonies like Barbados and Virginia. They were not arriving as immigrants seeking opportunity. They were being exported as a solution to a political problem. This diagram illustrates the market value of those on board. Upon arrival, these individuals were auctioned to plantation owners. Records indicate a single Irish laborer could be traded for approximately 900 pounds of raw cotton or tobacco. On the plantations, they worked side by side with enslaved Africans, clearing dense tropical brush and harvesting crops under a sun far hotter than anything they had known in Ireland. The labor was grueling, the punishments were frequent, and the mortality rates were high. When a person is stolen from their home, bought at auction, and worked until they die, the legal distinction between servant and slave can feel like a distinction without a difference. But in the 17th century, that label determined the fate of generations. It is a mistake to view the Irish arrivals as willing immigrants signing employment contracts. While some did go voluntarily, thousands more were political prisoners and children taken from the streets of Irish cities. However, colonial law categorized these two groups of laborers using entirely different logic. One was viewed as a debt to be paid, the other was viewed as a property title. This timeline shows the structure of indentured servitude. Under this system, the laborer's status was a temporary condition. Even when forced, the law recognized a fixed end date, usually 5 to 10 years, after which the individual was legally free. Compare that to the second timeline, chattel slavery. This system, forced upon African people, classified the human being as permanent property. There is no end date. Instead, the line continues and branches downward. Those branches represent an inherited status. Under chattel slavery, the condition of the mother was legally passed to the child. The Irish might be worked to death, but their children were born free. For enslaved Africans, the institution was designed to be inescapable across generations. In practice, many Irish laborers died from yellow fever or exhaustion within their first 3 years of service. For them, the theoretical promise of freedom at the end of a decade never arrived. These legal categories allowed colonial authorities to treat the Irish as a temporary labor force, while building a permanent, racialized hierarchy that would define American society for centuries. By the mid-19th century, a new wave of Irish arrived. Fleeing the Great Famine, over 1 million refugees entered an America that was rapidly building canals and railroads. A dark economic calculation emerged during this era. Because enslaved Africans were expensive, permanent investments, plantation owners and contractors were often unwilling to risk them on the deadliest construction projects. For the most lethal tasks, like digging the New Basin Canal in New Orleans or the Erie Canal in New York, employers turned to the Irish. Industrialists noted that if an Irish worker died, they lost nothing. There was no capital investment to protect, and there were always more desperate refugees waiting to take the shovel. In the Louisiana swamps, men worked waist-deep in black muck and stagnant water. In these disease-ridden conditions, an estimated 8,000 Irish laborers died from yellow fever and cholera while digging a single canal. Their status as free men made them the most expendable labor force in the country. Because no one owned them, no one was incentivized to keep them alive. The death toll on these projects was so high that thousands of Irish workers were buried in unmarked graves along the canals and railroad tracks they helped build. At Duffy's Cut in Pennsylvania, the remains of 57 men were only identified 170 years after they disappeared. Survivors of this labor often lived in the poorest districts of Boston and New York, packed into cramped tenements. They were frequently barred from other employment by signs stating "No Irish need apply." We don't need to mislabel the Irish as slaves to acknowledge that they were exploited by a system that viewed their lives as entirely replaceable. Over the next century, the Irish leveraged their numbers to gain a foothold in American life. Service in the Civil War provided a credential of loyalty, and they began to form powerful voting blocs in major cities. Out of the harsh conditions of the mines and canals, Irish labor organizers like Mother Jones emerged. They spent decades fighting for the safety regulations and child labor laws that the first generations of Irish immigrants had never known. By 1960, descendants of those refugees had moved from the tenements into the mainstream of American politics, culminating in the election of John F. Kennedy. The history of the Irish in America is not a simple story of triumph or tragedy. It is the story of a people who were once treated as disposable tools, but who stayed long enough to help build the nation that once tried to work them to death.